Okay, so once again, good evening and welcome. Our Cultural Heritage Series event tonight is titled Myth vs. Reality. This event is being sponsored by the Office of Equity, Diversity, and Opportunity for Henrico County Public Schools. My name is Xavier Bessie, and on behalf of the entire office, I want to sincerely thank you all for joining us. If you're not here right now and you're watching this, thank you just as equally. Before we begin, just a couple of things to remember. Please remain muted unless you are asked to unmute. Please type questions and or encouragements into the chat. Emojis are welcome as well. This event is being recorded and will be posted on the EDO YouTube channel. So if you miss anything or if you want to go back to this, you are more than welcome to do so. Speaking of social media, please follow us on social media. Our team has been working extra hard recently to bring you all content relating to our office and the work of our wonderful equity ambassadors. We're lucky and fortunate enough to have 3 of those equity ambassadors here to help me present tonight. So thank you to all of them. As you can see, as the kids say, our handles and our ats, our account names are actually listed on the screen next to the icons that they pertain to. So we have a Twitter and Instagram and Facebook, and we have our own website, which you can find by just going to HCPS's home site. Our agenda for this evening is we are going to begin with brief introductions from myself and the students that I previously mentioned. We will go over briefly the Destination 2025 alignment, as well as the CREM model that our office kind of bases all of our work around. We will then get into a brief history on Asian American and Pacific Islander heritage, and then we will follow that with AAPI achievements and the development of the U.S. We will then discuss the Asian American movement, AAPI activists, and other influential figures throughout our nation's history. And we will close things by talking about the Asian American experience in the 21st century. And after that, with time permitting, we will end with a Q&A session. So to help introduce this evening, once again, my name is Xavier Bessie. I'm a program assistant here for the Office of Equity, Diversity, and Opportunity. One of my main roles here is working with the students. I am super lucky and fortunate to be able to see them on a weekly basis at least once. And one of the roles that I had over the course of this past school year is running 3 different book clubs. And one of those books was The Making of Asian America by Dr. Erica Lee, and 3 of the students who were a part of that book club volunteered. I promise I did not force them. They volunteered to help me present some of the material that we learned and discussed throughout this past year. So to help me today, we have...
My name is Shanor Chaudhary, and I'm a sophomore at Glen Ellen High School and an equity ambassador there.
I'm Nat Taylor. I go to Freeman High School and I'm also an equity ambassador.
Hi, I'm Nishka. I go to Deep Run High School. I'm a junior and I'm also an equity ambassador.
Yes, you all are equity ambassadors, fabulous ones at that. All right, and also before we begin, we want to go over once again briefly the Destination 2025, the plan for HCPS. To help me with that is our own Tiffany Lewis.
Yes, thank you so much, Xavier. So we like to anchor our work when we do programming, when we are providing trainings. We like to make sure that our audience is fully aware of the work and the grounding of the work that we do in our office. And so if you look here, Our Destination 2025 is, or the plan for HCPS is actually our strategic plan as a school district. And so as you see, there are 4 cornerstones there: safety and wellness, which includes establishing and maintaining a school climate that is equitable and inclusive for all stakeholders; academic growth, which focuses on supporting students to reach their potential by core content and skills and life-ready skills. We have relationships, which promote the building of authentic, trusting connections that promote engagement from all stakeholders. And then we have equity and opportunity, which calls for a collective approach from all stakeholders to reduce disparities and to cultivate meaningful, culturally relevant experiences. And so to do that, if we go to the next slide, one of the ways that we address our Destination 2025 strategic plan is through our Cultural Heritage Series. And so in alignment with the plan, we provide a particular focus on Cultural Heritage Months that we receive the most requests for from our Henrico community and that represent the diversity of HCPS. And so for this Cultural Heritage Series, we have designed programming specifically for Black History Month or African American Heritage Month in February, Asian American Pacific Islander Heritage Month in May, Hispanic Latinx Heritage Month in September and October, and then Native American Indigenous Peoples Heritage Month in November. And so to talk a little bit very briefly about how this shows up really in our classrooms. Another touch point to the HCPS strategic plan is visible in our transformation of the curriculum. And we do that to ensure that there's alignment with our Henrico learner profile and our deeper learning model, while using and implementing the culturally responsive education model, or what we refer to as the CREM, as you see on your screen. We use that as a lens and as a way to then articulate the instructional design and the instructional delivery expectations for our teachers and our learners. And so CREM is designed to be the lens, again, that we apply to our Henrico learner profile and our deeper learning model. And this model, the CREM model, was designed back in 2019 with input from all stakeholders: students, staff, family, and community members. And so we want to make sure that we understand that what we are producing is not just off of the whim of the Office of EDO, but it is grounded in research and it is supported throughout our county strategic plan.
Thank you, Tiffany. No one could go through that information as quick as you. Tiffany is our resident expert here when it comes to the Cultural Heritage Series events. This is actually my first one hosting, so thank you, Tiffany, for trusting me. Also, before we begin, I just kind of want to give a quick disclaimer before we start. The book we are using, as I mentioned before, as a vehicle for tonight is The Making of Asian America by Dr. Erica Lee. This book is rather dense and complex, especially for high school level students. Some of the topics and slides we'll cover tonight may be considered too mature for younger audience members. None of us that are hosting tonight are AAPI experts. We are here tonight to simply share our experiences and thoughts from our book club after reading The Making of Asian America. Tonight, we really just hope to teach you all something about the history of our country, as well as possibly dispel a myth or two that you have heard along the way. So to help me really get into this, we will have Nishka read this very first slide.
APPI, how APPI month came into fruition. In 1978, Congress and President Jimmy Carter established Asian Pacific American Heritage Week. The month was a brainchild of Jeannie Ju, a former Capitol Hill staffer, who shared the idea with Representative Frank Horton, who introduced the legislation that formed it. The first 10 days of May were chosen to coincide with the two most important milestones in Asian Pacific American History Month during the month of May. The arrival in the United States of the first Japanese immigrants was on May 7th, 1843, and the contributions of Chinese workers to the building of the Transcontinental Railroad which was completed on May 10, 1869. The term Asian American was first coined in 1968 by the student activist Yuji Ichiwaka and Emma G. By the 1980s, the U.S. Census Bureau grouped persons of Asian ancestry and created the category Asian Pacific Islander, which continued in the census of 1990s. In 2000, Asian and Pacific Islander became the two separate racial categories. And the picture on top from Times is of Emma G. and Yuhi Ichiwaka.
Yes, thank you, Nishka. Also, so our next slide, we kind of wanted to kick things off with an audience question that is open for anyone here in attendance tonight. And that question is, what percentage of the U.S. population do you think is currently made up of Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders? Does anybody in the audience out there want to take a crack at this? I feel like I'm back in my book clubs trying to get the students to respond. Feel free to type in the chat as well. Nat, do you know this answer? Do you want to take a guess?
I think I do know this answer because I looked it up earlier, but I can say it if you want me to.
Okay, yes. What's the answer?
7.5%.
Yes. So Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders currently make up around 7.5% of the total U.S. population. Pacific Islanders make up about 1.5 million people in the U.S. currently, which is roughly 0.5% of the total AAPI population. So part one for tonight, we're really going to be talking about, briefly, we're going to be talking about our book, The Making of Asian America, as well as provide a brief history of Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders. So to kind of begin that discussion, we want to talk about some background knowledge and some reminders. So Asian is the term that we use today to describe a person having origins in any of the original peoples of the Far East, Southeast Asia, or the Indian subcontinent, including, for example, Cambodia, China, India, Japan, Korea, Malaysia, Pakistan, the Philippine Islands, Thailand, and Vietnam. Asia is the largest and most diverse continent on planet Earth. It is home to over 40 countries and 4 billion people. Asia has both the highest and lowest points on the surface of Earth, as well as the world's widest climatic extremes, and produces the most varied forms of vegetation and animal life on Earth. Even within respective Asian countries, there are varying people, groups, customs, languages, and traditions. And then when we talk about the Pacific Islands, a Pacific Islander is a person having origins in any of the original peoples of Hawaii, Guam, Samoa, or any of the other Pacific Islands. Since first discovering the Pacific Ocean, Western explorers have called these Pacific Islands Oceania, with 3 subregions, which are Melanesia, Polynesia, and Micronesia. The Pacific Islands include over 30,000 islands, reefs, and limestone outcroppings populated with Pacific Islanders who speak different languages and belong to very different cultures. So when we say Asian American or Pacific Islander, we are talking about people who may have ties to areas, cultures, languages, beliefs, and styles that are extremely different from one another. So here we have 2 separate maps kind of displaying the regions we are referring to when we're talking about these different immigrants. On the left, kind of in the highlighted circle, is what we know as Asia. There are more people living inside that circle than outside of it on the entire planet, believe it or not. Asians make up more than half of our planet's population, with about 4.5 billion people, which is roughly 60% of the world's population. The map on the right is showcasing the 3 different subregions, Micronesia, Melanesia, and Polynesia, as well as, if you look closely, you can get a better understanding of how many different islands we are really talking about. Okay, so for our first student panel question, we want to begin with a question that's just very introductory. So Nat, what made you decide to join the Making of Asian American Book Club this year?
So, I joined the Making of Asian America book club because I wanted to learn about the history of Asian America, like obviously. So I felt like the Asian Americas have like a really vast history, and that's kind of built into the foundation of the US. And the fact that we like don't talk about it as much as we should in some of our classes, like social studies and just in general in the US culture, made me want to learn more. Um, I also have Filipino and Thai heritage myself, and so that made me want to learn more about other groups within Asia. I heard positive reviews regarding this book from some people I know, and so seeing that it was available as a book club option from Equity Ambassadors, I really wanted to try the book.
Awesome. Thank you, Nat. So when we're talking about our book, just a brief kind of summary of our book. It's written by Dr. Erica Lee. She is a professor at the University of Minnesota. Her book is currently the definitive guide to the history of Asian Americans. It is the latest, most comprehensive book that I have come across. The book provides a history of Asian Americans and their role in American life from the arrival of the first Asians in the Americas to their present day experience in the 21st century. The book covers the long history of anti-Asian discrimination and policy within our country and in other countries close to us. The book also highlights Asian American Pacific Islander achievements and influential activists and figures. And the book ends by focusing on the United States as a global interconnected society and what that means going forward. All right, so our next student panel question will be for Nishka. Nishka, who was the first Asian group to settle in the U.S.? When and where did they do so?
Sorry, I thought my mic was muted.
You're fine.
Mailmen or Filipino fishermen and sailors arrived as early as 1763 and through the 1800s. Mailmen who served as indentured slaves or crew aboard Spanish like ships jumped ship in the Gulf of Mexico and arrived in the United States. As a result, the first Filipino-American settlements were established on the coast of what is now known as Louisiana.
Yes. Thank you, Nishka. Okay, so we are going to begin kind of our conversation on the history of Asian American immigration by talking about the first major wave of immigration to the continental U.S., which occurred in the mid-1800s. Asian populations made their way to the U.S. long before 1850, but the opening of trade relations between China and the U.S., as well as the discovery of gold and numerous other factors abroad, led to the first surge of immigration and settlement in the U.S. by different Asian groups during the 19th century or 1800s. So when people refer to this time period as the first major wave, they're really talking about settlement. Asians have been in this country before 1800. Asians have even fought for the U.S. going back to the Revolutionary War of 1775. In the 1830s, thousands of Asians from a handful of different countries came to Hawaii, which was later annexed in 1898, and worked as indentured laborers on sugar and pineapple plantations, as well as other farms. In 1844, the U.S. and China signed a treaty of peace, amity, and commerce. In 1848, the discovery of gold in California resulted in hundreds of thousands of people flocking to the U.S., specifically the West Coast. Between 1850 and 1870, 63,000 Chinese came to the U.S., mostly California. During this time, there was a massive movement of Chinese to different places around the world, including Southeast Asia and Canada, as well as Australia. During the 1870s is when there's this major shift in the U.S. in terms of public and loud sentiment, anti-Asian sentiment that leads to legislation to kind of decrease and get rid of immigration from these Asian countries. Congress approved the Naturalization Act barring Chinese from attaining U.S. citizenship, as well as the Chinese Exclusion Act in 1882 is another big one that we will talk about later. In the early 1900s, and in the 1870s, sentiment came after this economic panic in the U.S., and that is a common theme throughout the history of America and how we treat different Asian groups. You always got to keep in mind the political and economic factors that were going on behind the scenes during these different times. In the early 1900s is the first major wave of Korean immigration to the U.S. Koreans were fleeing political unrest at home and were drawn by work on Hawaiian sugar plantations. Between 1885 and 1924, an estimated 380,000 Japanese immigrated to the U.S. because of a massive movement of Japanese to other countries around the world, not just the U.S. Industrialization and taxation of farmers were huge factors in that. So if you can see through these brief bullet points, the first major wave of Asian immigration to the continental U.S. Was the result of a number of different factors. It wasn't just because of gold or the U.S. growing and forming into its own country. Wars and rebellion going on in these different Asian countries had a major impact, as well as political and economic instability, taxation and industrialization, overcrowding, and not to mention the U.S.'s recruitment in these countries to attract workers to come and be a source of cheap labor. Around this time, we need to keep in mind that the transatlantic slave trade and slavery were recently became illegal in Britain and the U.S., so Asian immigrants were recruited as a source of cheap labor for a number of different businesses. All right, so our next student panel question for Nishka. What was the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882? How did it come to be? When was it finally repealed? And what were some of its impacts?
Many Americans on the West Coast blame Chinese workers to be the cause of declining wages, even though Chinese workers only made up 0.002% of the nation's population. Because of these sentiments, Congress passed the Chinese Exclusion Act in 1882 in order to get rid of cheap labor. It was the first significant law restricting immigration into the United States and the first to explicitly suspend immigration for a specific nationality. Banned all Chinese workers from entering the country for at least 10 years, and this led to further immigration restrictions against other groups such as Middle Easterns, Hindus, East Indians, and Japanese. Chinese immigrants and their American-born families remained unable to to get their citizenship until 1943 with the passage of the Maxson Act.
Mm-hmm.
The Chinese Exclusion Act marked a shift in which the United States went from a country of acceptance to a gatekeeping one.
Yes, and obviously this is kind of the first major policy instituted by the U.S. that had a major impact on immigration around the world. Canada and Mexico and other countries that aren't exactly our neighbors saw this policy and instituted their own policies that were similar. Obviously, since the Chinese Exclusion Act, debates and controversy over and around immigration in this country have continued. You can also see that we are now a country, for different reasons based on who you ask, that is more willing to provide money and supplies and military help to countries in need than accept refugees and immigrants ourselves. So kind of born out of these anti-Asian sentiments in the middle of the 1800s is the birth of Chinatowns. Obviously, I think everybody knows what Chinatowns are, and they are looked at today as a place for, great food, different culture, different people, authentic experiences. But Chinatowns were actually born in California during the middle 1800s out of necessity and as a result of blatant racism. Chinatowns were where Asian entrepreneurs could set up shop with less risk of being driven out of town or being violently hurt. And different Asian groups could finally find a sense of the cultures that they recently left behind and find access to essential things such as healthcare, banking, schools, food, and just a sense of community, which I think we all can take for granted at times. All right, so our next student panel question, Nat, what surprised you the most from reading our book, The Making of Asian America?
So there are two things that surprised me the most from the book. The first was just how Asian immigrants were being transported to the Americas all the way back to the 1500s. This was a lot earlier than I expected. From the beginning of Europe's so-called discovery of the Americas, Asian workers were being enlisted as prisoners and sent to Latin America as cheap labor for the Spanish Empire. This means that a sizable Asian American population had been established as early as the mid-18th century, which was about the same time that the California Gold Rush happened. The second was how the number of blatantly racist anti-Asian laws and policies that were being enacted during the 19th century and early 20th century. A fair amount of these bills referred to as Asians as downright aliens and less than human, which is wildly different than how we think of Asian Americans today. They weren't just being racist, they were being openly and discriminatory without any regard for these people. So yeah.
Yes, thank you, Nat. And that kind of takes us to part 2 of our presentation for tonight, which is focusing on what Nat was just saying, language, the power of narrative. And we are also going to highlight some Asian American and Pacific Islander achievements. All right, so the Transcontinental Railroad, which I'm sure everyone has heard of, but maybe not everything that comes with the Transcontinental Railroad. Nat, take it away.
So the Transcontinental Railroad. Construction first took place from 1863 to 1869, following the population boom in the western U.S. because of the Gold Rush. It was originally known as the Pacific Railroad. It was the first continuous railroad line across the United States. The railroad opened the markets of the West Coast and Asia to the East Coast of the U.S. It also brought products of Eastern industry to the growing populace beyond the Mississippi. There was a huge popular sentiment at the time that this railroad united our young nation. At one time in the 1800s, almost 1 in 5 Chinese in America was employed by the railroad. 11,000 Chinese men were recruited from one southern Chinese province and were then mustered into work gangs at the docks and then ferried to the California Sierras to shovel and haul away dirt and rock. 15,000 to 20,000 Chinese workers worked on the railroad at some point. The Chinese workers were paid less than European immigrants and had to pay for their own food and board.
Thank you, Nat. So this is a map of the Pacific Railroad, the Transcontinental Railroad that we are talking about. The specific railroad line that we are discussing right now is the one that is highlighted in green, which started in California and made its way to Utah to meet up with the Union Pacific line that started in the east. So this is a famous photo that I'm sure some of you have seen. This was the site of the dramatic completion on May 10th, 1869 of the first transcontinental railroad in the U.S. A giant crowd gathered to witness these final ceremonies, and this famous photograph marked the occasion. At the time of this photograph, Chinese immigrants made up 90% of that green line, 90% of the Central Pacific Rail line workers. No Asian immigrants were hired to work on the Union Pacific line that started in the east. 1,200 Chinese workers died while completing this transcontinental railroad, and not one was allowed in this photo. So, did this railroad bring together our young country? So with that being said, the U.S. is often referred to as a nation of immigrants. And this kind of started with John F. Kennedy in one of his speeches. Except for those of Native American ancestry, we can all trace our heritage back to somewhere other than the U.S. geographically. George Washington said that America is open to receive not only the respectable stranger, but the oppressed and persecuted of all nations and religions. Various moments in our history show that we have not always lived up to that standard. All right, another audience question. Let's see if we can get a response this time. Can anybody tell me what this photo depicts? Anybody want to take a guess? You can look in the background for a hint. Did I hear Ellis Island? Yes, that is correct. This is Ellis Island in New York. This was the major immigration center of the U.S. between 1890 and 1930. Roughly 12 million immigrants were processed at Ellis Island, and they were given permission to enter the U.S. from there. Most immigrants were processed through Ellis Island in a matter of a few hours, and only 2% that arrived on the island were prevented from entering the U.S. These statistics kind of make me think of what I was taught in school growing up, especially when it pertains to Ellis Island, that, you know, Ellis Island kind of represents the ideal America in the American dream. If you physically make it to the U.S. and you're willing to work extremely hard, you can achieve whatever you want. You can be whoever you want. So I've always, when I was growing up, I always kind of viewed Ellis Island and the Statue of Liberty as these grand symbols for equality and freedom. But as I got older and learned more, it became clear that not everyone subscribes to this notion. And one quick way to kind of dispel that notion is just by looking at another immigration center, which is Angel Island. So this is Angel Island in San Francisco Bay, California. It was also a major immigration center at this time. Obviously, Angel Island being on the West Coast had a major factor in that. I don't know about you all, but growing up in North Carolina, I was never taught about Angel Island in school. So when I did find out about it, I kind of asked myself, you know, what was the major difference between Ellis Island and Angel Island? One of them, yes, is there were less people that went through in Angel Island. But the biggest difference between the two that, you know, we found throughout our studying of this book was that the immigrants that came to Ellis Island were mostly white and had European ancestry. The vast majority of people who came through Angel Island were Asian, as well as a smaller portion were Russian or Mexican. Passengers arriving in San Francisco were screened aboard ships and separated by nationality. Keep in mind that this is after the passing of the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882. Europeans and first-class passengers that happened to arrive on the West Coast were generally permitted immediate entrance to the city. Asians, along with those other groups that I mentioned, such as Mexicans and Russians, were ferried to Angel Island. About 175,000 Chinese and 60,000 Japanese immigrants were detained under oppressive conditions at Angel Island, generally lasting from 2 weeks to 6 months. Obviously, that's a lot longer than the 2 minutes that I talked about. That was common at Ellis Island before being allowed to enter the U.S. if they were allowed. So during this time, immigration officials at Angel Island employed discriminatory policies that were used to prevent Asians from immigrating into the country as a result of the Chinese Exclusion Act and other policies afterwards. As the Chinese Exclusion Act banned those who were not quote unquote skilled workers, the immigration authorities employed harsh efforts to expose what they often perceived as fraud, even though it wasn't. They used exhaustive interrogation tactics, and they waited as long as it took to confirm different stories. They would keep the immigrants on the island for weeks or months, often separating them from their own families. Those immigrants were asked about the tiniest of details relating to their families and their histories, as well as their hometowns and occupations. The immigrants were also subjected to extensive physical examinations that violated their Asian cultural norms and were much more elaborate and intrusive than the ones that were performed at Ellis Island. Treatment would be provided for different diseases if they could pay for it. The Angel Island facility was also used as a deportation center for those already in the country who were found to be in violation of the Chinese Exclusion Act. So just by studying Angel Island and Ellis Island, I think it's clear that our nation hasn't always been a nation that is completely accepting of immigrants. All right, so part 3, the Asian American Movement, AAPI activists, and the Asian American experience in the 21st century. Student panel question for Nat. Who is one AAPI activist who stuck out to you from our book and why?
So the one AAPI activist that stood out to me was someone named David Lee. So David Lee, he was a young Japanese immigrant who became the president of the Korean National Association and the U.S. Immigration Interpreter at Angel Island. He helped thousands of struggling Korean refugees get admitted into a country despite the racist immigration system in the early 20th century. By appealing to Asian Island immigration officials and spending many hours working with Korean immigrants to help them understand American culture, his organization was able to help bring in thousands more Korean immigrants, which, as previously mentioned, was very difficult at the time. The mass majority of these Koreans were fleeing their native land and because of Japanese occupation. Lee and his organization, the Korean National Association, gave a sense of hope in America, which was hard to come by at this time due to the anti-Asian, specifically the anti-Korean sentiment in the country at this time. Lee and the KNA also began a weekly newspaper that was written in Korean and provided updates on immigration, opportunities, and most importantly, a sense of community. So that's why I think he's a real hero.
Thank you, Nat. All right, so now we're going to briefly discuss the Asian American movement. The Asian American movement was inspired actually by the Black Power movement as well as the anti-Vietnam War movements of the 1960s. During the 1960s, as African Americans continued to challenge institutional racism, Asian Americans came to reflect on their own experiences, identifying how they also faced blatant discrimination by sharing their struggles to achieve ideals of freedom and equality for all. Asian American activists joined the civil rights movement. And then they took what they learned to start their own. The Asian American movement was a social movement for racial justice, most active during the late 1960s through the mid-1970s, which brought together people of various Asian ancestries in the U.S. who protested against racism, and U.S. neo-imperialism demanded changes in institutions such as colleges and universities, organized workers, and sought to provide social services such as housing, food, and healthcare to poor people. The coining of the phrase Asian American in the movements that led to its creation was the direct result of radical cross-racial and ethnic solidarity building during the 1960s. Before 1968, the creation of a pan-ethnic Asian identity did not really exist in the U.S. Thus, the newly created identity attempted to galvanize Asian people to come together, acknowledge their shared histories, and fight for collective liberation, not only in the U.S., but abroad. The Asian American movement helped create internal and external connections between different Asian groups, as well as between different minority groups. The Asian American movement also created community service programs, art, poetry, music, and other creative work. It offered a new sense of self-determination and raised the political and racial consciousness of Asian Americans. They fought for the development of ethnic studies programs that we are seeing in universities across the country now. They fought for an end to the Vietnam War and reparations for Japanese Americans that were forced into internment camps during World War II. Sorry, this is World War I. The creation of the very term Asian American served as a rejection of the derogatory term Oriental, which was used to describe Asian people for centuries. Before this, people of Asian ancestry identified with their ethnic group and didn't see that many commonalities with one another. Following the protest era of the 60s, Asian Americans were reinvigorated to fight for their rights in court and push for political representation. I also want to mention that before the 1960s, Asian Americans were more than willing to fight for their rights in court. It's actually pretty mind-blowing how quickly they were willing to take on different people in different cases in court, obviously probably in the back of their heads knowing that they weren't going to win, which just goes to show their bravery and just willingness to fight for what's right. One of the major turning points for the movement was the murder of a man named Vincent Chin. Vincent Chin was an industrial draftsman for an engineering firm that specialized in auto parts. In 1982, insecurities about booming Japanese auto manufacturers, a declining American auto industry, and the anti-foreigner rhetoric collided with fatal consequences. Vincent Chin, a young Chinese American, was beaten to death just days before his wedding by two white men in Detroit, Michigan. The men thought Chin to be Japanese and decided to yell racial slurs at him, trail him out of a bar, and beat him with a baseball bat. Chin would die 4 days later at the age of 27. His killers were Chrysler plant supervisor Ronald Evans and his stepson, laid-off auto worker Michael Nitz. Following the original trial, they were given a $3,000 fine and 3 years of probation. The judge said that they weren't the kind of men you send to jail. This decision and his murder obviously outraged a great number of people and sparked outrage in the form of protests across the region. These protests were led by a female journalist who is very famous today. Her name is Helen Zia. Asian Americans channeled their emotions into protests that brought together a diverse group of churches, synagogues, and Black activists. Their work led to the case being retried at the federal level. Chin's case was the first federal civil rights case for an Asian American. Evans was then found guilty and sentenced to 25 years for second-degree murder, but that decision was later repealed, and both Evans and Nitz avoided jail time once again. A civil suit was then filed against Evans and Nitz with a settlement out of court, resulting in their paying of $1.5 million to Chin's estate. The recent spike in anti-Asian violence has caused Vincent Chin's name to resurface in the news. As we are less than a month away from the 40-year anniversary of his death, we should be aware of stories like Vincent Chin's in order to see how far our society has come since then. So right here is on the left, you can see a picture of Vincent Chin. In the middle is a photo from one of the protests that followed soon after. The photo on the right is actually Helen Zia. And if you are interested in learning more about Vincent Chin's story, you should check out From a Whisper to a Rallying Cry, which you will be able to get from your school's library if you're a high schooler. We'll talk about that more later. All right, so our next student panel question, Shanor is finally getting her time to shine. What, in your opinion, is a big issue that AAPI youth face today, inside or outside of school?
I think that's a great question. I think a big issue that AAPI youth face today is the stigmatization of mental health issues, especially in our community. Often we are seen as model minorities and subconsciously try to fill these roles to fit in with a white-centered society. And our mental health can take a backseat. It's also common that we can perpetuate the problem ourselves by putting extra pressure on ourselves to be hard workers. And sometimes you can see this pressure from others in our community, such as parents, since this stigmatization can be passed down through generations.
Thank you, Shanor.
And then I can also take it away with this. I'm going to talk about Larry Itliong and Philip Vera Cruz. They were born in Itliong was born in the Philippines and migrated to the US, specifically Alaska, at the age of 14 in 1929. His story is very similar to many early Asian migrants' experiences. Itliong worked in different states, from canneries in Alaska to the railroads of Montana and the agricultural fields of California. He later earned the nickname Seven Fingers after losing 3 of his fingers due to a work-related accident. And in 1930, he joined his first strike and subsequently co-founded the Alaska Canneries Workers Union. Itliong then served in the Army from 1936 to 1943. And upon returning, he formed the Filipino Farm Labor Union in 1956 and the Multi-Ethnic Agricultural Workers Organization Committee in 1959. And in 1965, Itliong and his friend Philip Vera Cruz spearheaded the Delano Grape Strike. They quickly teamed with the widely known labor leaders Cesar Chavez and Dolores Huerta and their NFWA organization to demand farm workers' rights.
Yes, thank you, Schnorr. The purpose of the Delano grape strike was to get union contracts, higher pay, and improved working conditions. The organizers, including Larry Italiong and Philip Vera Cruz, knew the strike could not be successful without the solidarity of Mexican farm workers as well. Otherwise, Mexican workers would be brought in to break their strike. In 1966, Chavez and Italiong's two groups joined together to form the now famous United Farm Workers Association. Their tactics included picket lines, marches, and an international boycott on Delano grapes. The Delano grape strike lasted 5 years and won better pay and benefits for agricultural workers. Asian Americans are often stereotyped, as Schnorr said, as complacent, silent, hard workers, but that completely diminishes and ignores their history of radical labor organizing. In a famous speech, Italiong said, "I feel we are just as good as any of them. I feel we have the same rights as any of them, because in that Constitution, it said that everybody has equal rights and justice." Today, I think people see the Delano grape strike and think of the farm workers movement in America as being led by Cesar Chavez and Dolores Huerta. But hopefully after these two slides, you can see that neither would be possible without people like Larry Italiong and Philip Vera Cruz, two exceptional Filipino Americans. Here are some photos of these two gentlemen. On the left is Philip Vera Cruz. On the right is Italiong with Cesar Chavez. And below is a famous photo from the actual Delano grape strike. Next, so here is a list of different activists and influential figures that stood out to all of us. I won't read through all of these, but you all should take the time to do so. I think Yuji Ichioka, we mentioned earlier, he is one of the founders of the term Asian American, and he also started a student activist group as well during that time. Gary Locke was the first Asian American governor of a mainland state, which was Washington. Winona Guo and Priya Vulchi were founders of the racial literacy nonprofit group Choose and the authors of the book Tell Me Who You Are. The book Tell Me Who You Are was also another book that the Equity Ambassadors had the option to read this year. And those two young women are truly exceptional. They were named 2 of Teen Vogue's 21 Under 21 Young People Changing the World. They are currently juniors in college, and when they began writing the book Tell Me Who You Are, which is a compilation of different personal narratives from different people all across the U.S., they actually kind of began that book when they were in high school, so it's actually pretty cool to kind of bring that up and share that with the other Equity Ambassadors to kind of give them some inspiration to, change the world. You're never too young to change the world. Here are some other activists that we wanted to mention. Margaret Chung being one of them. She's actually one of the people mentioned in another book that our office is providing to schools that we will discuss later. She was the first Chinese American female doctor. She founded one of the first Western medical clinics in San Francisco's Chinatown during the 1920s. All right, so one of the big things and topics throughout our book, as well as in our society today, is the model minority myth, which I'm sure everyone has heard of. This myth dates back to World War II and the Cold War. The model minority myth is the idea that Asian Americans are a polite, law-abiding group who have achieved a higher level of success than the general population through some combination of innate talent and a pull yourselves up by the bootstraps immigrant mentality. So there are many problems with the model minority myth. On a fundamental level, the myth erases individuality and individual attitudes, experiences, and cultures. As we mentioned with one of the very first slides, when you're talking about Asian Americans, you need to keep in mind the vast differences in cultures, experiences, and individuality. The myth pits different minority groups against one another, which leads to the myth distracting us from striving and working together toward liberation, equity, and inclusivity for everyone. The model minority myth is used as evidence to deny or downplay the impact of racism and discrimination on people of color in the U.S. People will use it to ask questions like, why do you want to change the status quo? Look at Asian Americans, look at how well they're doing. We don't need to do anything differently. Obviously untrue. Number 4, hides the continual racial discrimination and violence against Asian Americans, which they have faced since their arrival in the U.S., and which is something that you clearly cannot deny after the past few years. And lastly, it's just not true. For starters, many Asian Americans, many Americans believe that Asian Americans consider themselves as white, honorary white, or white adjacent, but studies show that the majority of Asian Americans, around 60%, actually self-identify as people of color. The model minority myth is clearly false if you look at the disparities in wages, education, and poverty among different Asian American groups, with pay disparities among Asian American and Pacific Islander groups is a major example of that. If you look at different groups, such as for every $1.21 the average Indian American woman makes, a Samoan American woman makes 62 cents, so half of that. A Burmese American woman makes around 50 cents in comparison. So obviously those are vast differences. In fact, a 2018 Pew Research study found that Asian Americans were the most economically divided racial or ethnic group in the U.S. That was something that was shocking even for me. Another glaring statistic that we came across was that 1 in 7 Asian immigrants in America today is actually undocumented and facing potential deportation. So this next slide is kind of a graph to help you better visualize and understand what we're talking about. So this graph is focusing on median household income, as well as the percent of adults 25 or older with at least a bachelor's degree. So oftentimes when someone is trying to use the model minority myth as a talking point or something to back up their argument, they'll point out the Indian American and Taiwanese American statistics, but as you can see from this graph, they're much different. They're sort of outliers when in comparison to other Asian American groups. And I also found that it was interesting that the Filipino American, Japanese American, Korean American, and Chinese American statistics are pretty similar in the middle when they are the first 4 major groups to really immigrate into the U.S. All right, so some other statistics to kind of wrap up this presentation. We wanted to show you all to see where our nation and our county specifically are headed in the future. So the total population of the Pacific Islands is forecast to grow from 11 million to 17.7 million, or more than 60% by 2050. And if you do some research into the Pacific Islands, you'll see that there is major disputes in terms of land, as well as just land that is able to be used for different people. So overcrowding is going to become a major issue. So I think it's safe to say that more Pacific Islander people will be entering the U.S. On this graph, this map on the left shows that nearly half of all Asian Americans live in the West, which makes sense when you go back and look at the history of Asian American immigration. The U.S. Asian population is projected to pass 35 million by the year 2060. And this is after the AAPI population in the U.S. grew by 81% between 2000 and 2019. Asian Americans are the fastest growing group in the country. So here are some other graphs and statistics kind of show you AAPI growth strictly in our region, growth that will only continue. According to the Commonwealth Institute, the growth in the number of AAPI Virginians accounts for a substantial share, around 31% of Virginia's overall population growth since 2007. Loudoun County, I believe I'm pronouncing that right. I apologize if I am not. I'm still relatively new to the area. But the AAPI population growth in Loudoun County from 2010 to 2019 was 86%. According to the U.S. Census in Henrico County, Virginia, Asians make up the third largest demographic, representing about 9.1% of the population, which is roughly 37,000 people. So based on these statistics alone, I think it's fair to say that our education system needs to make a conscious effort to share AAPI stories and activists and individuals within our classrooms, regardless of our own identities and those of our students, by continually softening and blurring racial and ethnic lines. Contrary to what you may hear, diversity brings together Americans much more than it does in terms of tearing us apart. In reality, racial diversity is increasing not only at the nationwide level, but also within American families. Numerous young Americans consider themselves both white and members of a minority racial or ethnic group, which leads to this idea of transnationalism, which was discussed by Dr. Erica Lee throughout our book. So, Nishka, what does it mean to be transnational? Do you feel that American society embraces transnationalism? Should it? How can it be helpful?
Transnational means to extend oneself across national borders. Borders are man-made, so transnational relationships and ideals can help our world as a whole. By working together as a human race, we can tackle the problems that affect everyone, including climate change, water stress, human trafficking, coordinating efforts to help refugees, and responding to natural disasters and international conflicts.
Yes. So based on numerous studies, this idea of being transnational comes more easily to younger people who are shifting the social meanings of white and non-white. So here is some statistics that really showcase anti-AAPI sentiment and crime in the past few years, much of which has been fueled by the pandemic. 279 anti-Asian incidents were reported in 2020, a 77% increase since 2019. That's just 1 year, obviously. In 2021, there was a 339% increase in countrywide anti-Asian hate crimes when compared to 2020. So consecutive years of a dramatic increase. The March 2021 Atlanta spa shooting killed 8 people, 6 of which were Asian American women. The shooting in a Dallas hair salon that killed 3 Asian American women 2 weeks ago was linked to anti-AAPI racism. There have also been 2 other shootings in Dallas alone over the past 2 months that took aim at Asian-run businesses. 83% of Asian American parents are concerned that their children may be bullied because of their race or ethnicity. 1 in 6 Asian American adults experienced a hate crime or hate incident in 2021, an increase from 1 in 8 in 2020. 1 in 12 reported an incident during January, February, and March of this year. Keep in mind, as always with these kinds of statistics, that many people choose not to report these incidents for a number of different reasons. According to Stop AAPI Hate, roughly 3,800 hate crimes against Asian Americans were reported from March 2020 to April 2021. American society blaming Asian Americans for viruses is not new. Sadly, you can trace this back to the 1800s. American society taking out their political and economic frustration on Asian Americans is not new, obviously, from this presentation alone. What is new, however, on a more positive note, is the recognition that AAPI entertainers are gaining throughout not only this country, but around the world. Though the fight is not over, AAPI artists, athletes, and entertainers are beginning to attain leading roles and garner the spotlight that they deserve in Western media. Here's a list of some famous AAPI entertainers. I'm sure you've heard of most of them. I know Olivia Rodrigo is very large with the younger audience. I actually, hand up, I didn't really know who she was until this year. I recently saw she was nominated for 7 Grammy Awards, which is incredible. So I should have heard about her a long time ago. But yeah, so keep that in mind. When we talk about, so Eileen Gu, number 5 right there, she is a famous and she's an incredible skier. She competed in the 2022 Winter Olympics, and she won 3 gold medals. Following this, she took a lot of hate from Americans online on Twitter, shocking, when she surprised many people when she competed for China. So she won these medals for China. She's Chinese American. In response to this hatred, she said, "I'm American when I'm in America, and I'm Chinese when I'm in China," she said at a press conference in Beijing. She went on to say, "I've been very outspoken about my gratitude to both countries for making me who I am." And I can't even add anything to that. That's such a beautiful response from such a young, talented athlete. And that just sums up this idea of transnationalism that we were just talking about. All right, so our last student panel question, Shanor, what would you like to see done in schools to enhance awareness and understanding when it comes to the history and plights of Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders?
I think providing more diversity in curriculum for our young students could really make a difference. I never really knew most of the material that was in this book, The Making of Asian America, until we started reading it. I also believe that focusing on accomplishments is really important. Asian Americans have faced enormous hurdles since their arrival to the US, as we've discussed through this whole presentation. And there are people who have endured these struggles and worked astronomically hard to achieve the success that they have, and they also deserve our recognition for that. In history classes, Asian Americans are often defined by their struggles, or their struggles in history are completely glossed over completely. And these new instructional practices could be a way to fix the way we view Asian American history.
So a mixture of balance and acknowledgement. So one way that our office is trying to increase that acknowledgement is by purchasing and providing the following books for all elementary and secondary schools in Henrico County Public Schools. Those books are Asian Americans Who Inspire Us, which will be provided to the elementary schools. This book, beautifully illustrated book, introduces readers of all ages to 16 different Asian Americans who changed the world. The middle schools will be receiving Asian American Women in Science. This book is written by Tina Cho. Readers will learn about how these exceptional women excelled in science, technology, engineering, and math. Hopefully this book will inspire young students to pursue STEM-related fields that are well-paying and are continuing to grow in terms of availability and importance within our nation and worldwide. High schools will receive The Making of Asian America, which we have been talking about during this entire presentation, as well as From a Whisper to a Rallying Cry, which I mentioned briefly earlier, which delves further into anti-Asian American sentiment in America and examines the killing of Vincent Chin in Detroit and the subsequent trials that followed. So we still have a little bit of time left, so we will open things up to a Q&A session for our wonderful audience here tonight. I just want to wrap up briefly by saying, that it has been an honor for me to be able to run the different book clubs this year. Tiffany ran Stamped last year, and she really helped me a lot when it came to the different books this year. I couldn't have done it without her or Dr. Mans or Leslie Brown. I think, if there's anything I've learned from these different book clubs, it's that in order to move forward, we need to look backward. This is a cliche statement that I'm sure everyone's heard, but it's also a true statement. We cannot hide our country's past, nor our own. History always repeats itself, especially to those who aren't aware of it. I always tell my equity ambassadors and students that it is okay to be wrong. It is okay to not know everything. It is okay if you aren't able to change someone's mind. It's most important to just be kind, to be willing to be vulnerable, to show up to different conversations and discussions like the one we're having tonight, to be okay with making mistakes on your journey towards awareness and anti-racism. When it comes to equity and inclusivity, action is the most important thing. It's the only thing, really. So with that being said, with the time we have left, we want to open things up for any questions that you all our audience may have. Thank you, Tiffany. Any questions? Miss Thrasher, I didn't know you were here. So let me quickly say that Miss Thrasher also helped me with this book club throughout the year. She put together wonderful playlists all year for all of the students to go through and look at on their own, podcasts, articles, anything you can think of. She put into these different playlists, which I actually linked in the last slide. So Miss Thrasher, I was thinking about you and I didn't even know you were going to be here. Do you have a question, Miss Thrasher? Let's hear it.
I do. Hi, everybody. Sorry, I'm trying to talk quickly because my kid and my dog are both acting. They're behind me right now, but I just wanted to give you all a shout out and say thank you for all of your hard work. You all did such an amazing job with this. I did want to ask you all, though, I was wondering if any of you all had done any kind of like reflections with this book club and the whole experience. Has it influenced? I'm wondering how it might have influenced your understanding of your own identity as an Asian American. Yeah, I guess that's my big question for y'all.
Great question. Thank you, Ms. Thrasher. Anybody want to answer that? Shanora, I can tell you're thinking. Go ahead.
I could kind of, I guess, answer it in a way. I think before the book, I had a very different view on what it means to be an Asian American, even though like I'm a South Asian American, but even as one, it was very easy to just look at it as like a one-sided thing. And I had an American identity and then a South Asian identity, and they were not interconnected. And I think looking at this book and seeing the vast stories of Asian Americans and how they started lives and legacies in America really taught me that those two things can be connected, and I can be Asian and American at the same time and feel comfortable with that.
Beautiful response. Thank you, Shanora. Nat, did you want to add to that? That's tough to follow.
It is. Kind of going off of that, I always I'm an Asian American, but I haven't learned about my past as much as I probably should have. I always kind of considered myself as an American first and maybe an Asian second. And so being able to go back and look at the legacy of kind of my culture, where it comes from, where it is in Filipino and Thai heritage, it was pretty interesting, and I thought that it contributed to just how far and how I looked at myself.
Very well said. Thank you. Thank you both. Any other questions?
Could I answer the previous question?
Yes, go ahead, Nishka. Sorry, I skipped right over you.
No, I feel like I was born in India and I moved here at a pretty young age of 9. So I tried to kind of fit into the crowd to become more American in a way, so that I wouldn't feel left out, or I wouldn't feel like I was the only Asian in the room. Because in my elementary school, it was just me and another girl who were Asian. And I felt, looking back at that, was kind of shocking to me because I didn't realize how less Asians were there at that school. And reading this book kind of made me connect back to people who have come before me, people who have gone through great hardships, and I've learned their story, and it's kind of made me connected in a way to more to my Asian heritage.
Yeah, and as you can see from the past 3 responses from these wonderful students, for starters, I want to thank all 3 of you for making the time to be here and for volunteering to participate in the book study throughout this whole school year, and for helping me put together this presentation. I think based on just your 3 answers alone right there, you all have taught me as much as this book over the course of this past year. So without getting too emotional, thank you guys again. Any other audience questions before we get out of here?
I just want to echo what's happening in the chat right now. for those viewing that can't see the chat, but I just want to go on record for stating that tonight's presentation was tremendously excellent. It is always encouraging to see young people take ownership of their learning. And you know, I really admire you and the work that you've done as students. You know, this is extra work. You've already endured quite an arduous school year. If you think about the start of the school year, not really knowing how things were going to pan out, and just look at yourselves. And all I keep thinking is just how proud those people that you talked about tonight must be of you. That even in their despair and even in the moments where they weren't able to tell their own stories, you have now made their stories justified and right. And you have brought so much clarity and professionalism and articulation to this presentation. So I commend you for that. I think that this is amazing. And I hope that you really take a moment after tonight to really reflect on the work that you've done and the right that you've done by this work and by the teenagers before you, stories who lived hundreds and thousands of years before you, who did not have the opportunity to share their stories. You have done that for them. And so I super acknowledge you for that. I definitely want to give a shout out to Xavier, to Mr. Bessie. Just a tremendous asset to HCPS. Just one of the most dedicated, hardworking, humble individuals I've ever had the chance of knowing and working with. And so I know the students echo those sentiments for sure. So this is awesome, Xavier. It's okay to say thank you. I know you don't like taking compliments, but I just wanted to say that.
I'm having trouble with my connection. I couldn't hear what you just said.
Right. Well, I'll say it again. You're great. You're fabulous. But yeah, I just wanted to add that I think tonight's presentation was amazing.
Thank you so much. And thank you again to Tiffany as well as Ms. Thrasher for all of their help this year. I don't want to, if we don't have any other questions tonight, you are free to go. I hope everyone has a great rest of the week. Hopefully it stops raining. I think it stopped raining. Hopefully I didn't jinx us. I hope everyone has a safe holiday weekend. Enjoy your extra day off. I know we all need it. It's a stressful time of year, so thank you again for making the time to be here.
Thank you, Mr. Bessie.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mr. Bessie. Have a good night, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank
Bye.
you. Thank you. Good night.
Bye, Nishka. Thank you so much. Bye, everyone. Stop presenting. Nishka, oh, I thought she had something else.